So I've been mentioning this moment several times, so I want to come back to it, or come to it and just compare them for just a moment. So if you take a look at page 527, I know it's backing us up quite a bit, sorry. 527, this is page 30 in the journal, 527. So here's this I've been referring to this several times. There's this master, here's what's going on in all of the divisions of the subjective logic as a whole. And this is where he talks about the movement from the formal concept and subjectivity to the real concept and objectivity to the adequate concept and the idea. So he gives you that kind of master overview of what's going on here. And then notice what he says on 527, right below the middle of the page. So he's saying second in its objectivity, that paragraph, everybody see where I'm at there? 527. So second in its objectivity, the concept is the fact itself as it exists in and for itself. So there's that language we see him already using. It exists in and for itself. It's being in and for itself. The formal concept makes itself into the fact. He uses that Zaka language, right? We saw at the end of the subjectivity chapter. By virtue of the necessary determinations of its form, right? So it is a fact, but not by virtue of the the material showing up, but as I said earlier, by virtue of the formal determinations themselves. So form engendering content, that's the way that works. And it thereby sheds the relation of subjectivity and externality that it had to that matter. So the shedding of it is what we saw at the end of the subjectivity chapter in the destructive syllogism. Or conversely, so another way of saying the same thing, objectivity is the real concept that has emerged from its inwardness and has passed over into existence. So now it's no longer a formal thing, it's actually the nature of reality itself. Then he says, after the hyphen, in this identity with the fact, so now he's talking about in objectivity. The concept thus has an existence which is its own existence. It doesn't belong to anything else. It's not beholden to anything else. It belongs to itself. It is its own and free. So it's its own and free. Both those, Hegel is pretty specific when he wants to be, right? It belongs to itself in certain ways, so it's not beholden to anything else. It stands on its own, and it's free in standing on its own. Has both those determinations. He says, but this existence is still a freedom which is immediate and not yet negative. So it stands over against something, but it hasn't generated itself. Being at one with the subject matter, so that's what I take him to be saying. Here's what I'm going to try to show in the whole of the objectivity chapter, is that you get an account of the concept, which is at once its own and free, but it's not a freedom yet where it determines itself and generates itself. It's not self-negating generation of its own determination. That's life. So that's the next chapter. But he says, being at one with, so literally being one with, that one's a good much. It literally says being one with the subject matter, objectivity. The concept is submerged into it. There's this language I was referring to. Its differences are objective determinations of existence in which it is itself again the inner. So it's submerged in it, it's not explicit in it, it's buried within it. That's what it means to be, its inner. As the soul is another way of expressing being inner, being within, of objective existence, the concept must give itself the form of subjectivity, must give itself the form we've seen. Well, what is that? Well, that's ultimately syllogistic form. That's what that means, right? That's what that's got to mean. The form of subjectivity is the form not of an agent, a personality, but a form of, as he's used the term subjectivity here, a form of formal structure. That means the structure of the syllogism. Must give itself the form of subjectivity that it immediately had as formal concept. And so in the form of the free concept, which in objectivity it still lacked, it steps forth over against that objectivity. So now it's not submerged in it, it steps out over against it. I submit to you that's what we see happening at the end of chemism, precisely that. And over against it, it makes therein the identity with it, with objectivity, which as objective concept it has in and for itself, into an identity that is also positive. So the identity it has when it's just one with it is now one that's the result of not just being literally submerged in it, but being the creator, the cause, the producer of it. That's how it's. Then he says, next paragraph, in this consummation, which the concept has the form of freedom, even in its objectivity, the adequate concept is the idea. So we take up from there. So look at what he says here on 649 again. This is right at the beginning of the second full paragraph down. Chemism is itself the first negation. You see on that? Chemism is so 649, chemism is itself the first negation. So it says here, chemism is itself the first negation of the indifferent objectivity and of the externality of determinants. It is still burdened, right? So now it's stepped out over against it. That's the first negation. It is still burdened, therefore, by the immediate self-subsistence of the object and with externality. Consequently, it is not yet for itself that totality of self-determination that proceeds from it and in which it is rather sublated. So he's telling you, look, here's what we've achieved and here's what we haven't achieved. What we've gotten to right now is the concept steps out over against objectivity. Objectivity is beholden to it, but the concept hasn't made itself into self-determination yet. So just to put it back in terms that we see on 527 again, it has become its own. It stands on its own, doesn't stand beholden within objectivity itself. Objectivity is beholden to it. So it stands on its own, but it's not yet fully free. Right? It's free from that being submerged, but it's not free to determine itself yet. So the teleology chapter has got to be about that problematic, about the problematic of how's the concept now standing over against objectivity demonstrate that it is itself self-determining, self-causative, self-generating from itself. So the task of the teleology chapter, I think, is clear. I cautiously use that term. Nothing's terribly clear in Hegel, certainly not in the depths that we're at right now. But let's at least say this much. It is to show how the concept gives itself the form of the free concept. To show how the concept, as Vec, as purpose, as end, gives itself the form of the free concept as an objective concept now, not just as a formal or subjective concept, but as an objective concept. And how it does so by positing itself precisely as this objective free concept. So that's the task. Right? It doesn't start there, because that's what we got to show. How does it begin? Well, it begins with the concept, now thought as Vec, as end, purpose, goal, as extrinsic to objectivity. Objectivity is now no longer being in and for itself, it's immediacy. So extrinsic teleology, which is what we're dealing with here, Hegel tells us that repeatedly. He goes back and says, this is one of his moments of praise for Kant, right? Kant has drawn this distinction. It's right here at the beginning of the teleology chapter where he says, Kant has drawn this momentous distinction. This is in the third critique. Kant has drawn this momentous distinction between extrinsic teleology and immanent teleology, or intrinsic teleology. Extrinsic purposiveness, Zweckmäßigkeit, and extrinsic or intrinsic purposiveness. And so some people will go to those passages and say, oh, thank God. He finally gave us a reference in other texts where we can say, oh, we can now read it through that distinction. We know, go back to the third critique, what that is in the third critique, how Hegel's talking about this. Internal or intrinsic teleology is all about organisms, right? And extrinsic teleology, according to Kant in third critique, is all about how everything exists for the sake of something else. So there you go. How do you get from something being a means, an instrument for other things, to it being an organism? That's what Hegel in the Kantian world is talking about. Now we know Kant gets there through the regulative constitutive distinction, right? He says the principle of purposiveness is a regulative principle, one that we use in order to understand the world, but it's not true of the world itself, right? So it's a standard, it's a version of the standard sort of Kantian, I won't call it a trick, turn, right? Whereby we say, look, I'm not claiming this is actually out there. It's not constitutive, even of the objects of experience. I'm saying it's regulative how we treat them so that we can make sense of them. So I can say that this is constitutively quality, quantity, relation, modality, first critiques, categories of experience. But what I can't say is how this fits into the broader fabric of the world. I say that by virtue of the regulative principles that say, oh, it fits in because it's at the use of something else, or it's an organism unto itself. And the difference is what? This is extrinsic teleology. It's a means if it can be used by something else, and it's intrinsic teleology if it is productive of itself. It's a whole that produces its own parts, and parts produce its own whole. This is how Hegel Kant famously defines organisms in paragraph 72. I'm doing that from memory, so don't go back and get the reference. I could be wrong, but somewhere around there in the third critique. And so we all get excited, right, at that moment. We say, "Ha! Now we know. Now we got something to do with to make some sense of this." So we'll say, a lot of times you'll read accounts of the teleology chapter will say, well, look, he's trying to solve the constitutive regulative problem in Kant. Nowhere does he say that. Right? What he does say is what I said earlier, which is there is a wonderful distinction that Kant has drawn. That distinction is between extrinsic and intrinsic teleology propositions. Let's work with that. And like Hegel oftentimes does, he wants to take up a distinction in his own way and not run with it in terms of the arguments that have already been had. So I think it's actually wrong to say that he's trying to solve anything in the Kantian framework or trying to solve a Kantian inherited problematic. We're so far beyond Kant at this point. Right? We're doing metaphysics of the numinal. Right? Already we are not doing Kant anymore. So I don't think that that's all of a sudden, oh, wait a minute, let me solve that one. It's not. So I think we'd be a lot better off by saying, okay, he clearly takes up that distinction from Kant, like he takes up other distinctions from other people. And, you know, like he's done with Spinoza, he's done this with Leibniz, he's done this with Descartes. You can look at all over these places and find them, but not one of them will trace back and say, yeah, that's what Leibniz meant by that. It just doesn't work that way. Or Spinoza or Descartes or Kant. So what does he say about his Zweck? Well, the first thing I think is useful is just to say this, that extrinsic teleology is about the realization, you could call it the objectification, of the Zweck, of the concept, in and through this immediacy. So it's about its realization. It's about how does the concept become realized. It's about how does the purpose become realized in objectivity, which now stands over against the concept. How does it get realized in objectivity? And it does so, Hegel claims, through the determinations of, no surprise, universality, particularity, and singularity, which is to say the concept qua Zweck, that's its purpose, realizes itself in immediate existence in accord with its own formal or structural determinations. It gives itself the form of freedom. So the purpose will realize itself in and by means of objects, here mechanical, chemical dimensions of those objects. Yet is not itself, at least initially, an object of that sort. It's not reducible to mechanical or chemical objects. It's something that's related to them, but it's not reducible to them. That's the standpoint from which we begin. More to be said about that, of course, but that's from where we begin. There's not going to be a moment here where it just all falls apart and collapses, but we're going to see that the concept as a Zweck can't stand extrinsic and be realized in objectivity. It's got to be realized in objectivity because it's a moment, an element within objectivity already. It's got to be immanent rather than extrinsic. That's the basic argument he's going to have to make, but not yet. Making the argument about how does it relate to, because that's where we got to. So then what is, I always think it's useful to start these things with this, because I think it will take away some of the associations that we normally have with these things. So start off by saying, okay, what does he mean by purpose? What's his Zweck? What the hell is that? For him, as has been defined thus far in the context of the logic itself, and no more. It can mean a whole other set of things, and Hegel will use it for those other things, right? There's a moment in the philosophy of spirit where he's talking about theoretical spirit and practical spirit. And he's talking about theoretical spirit, and he says, you know what the culmination of theoretical spirit is? It's where it posits ends. Zwecken, right? That's what he says about it, right? That's all it is. And then that's the transition into practical spirit. It's where you get a will, right? It's out of that. So he knows how to use it in that sense, right? He knows how to use it in what I would call an intentional or volitional context. That's clearly not what's going on here. Okay? So start off with what it's not. The Zweck here is not a purpose or end or goal set by or being pursued by a will. It's not volitional. Whether our will or God's will. If you were Leibniz, you would say this is God's will, right? Not what Hegel thinks. The concept is something other than something. It's not that through which or that towards which a will of any kind, be it human or divine, is proceeding. It's also not a potentiality. He doesn't give a modal analysis of Zweck. He doesn't say it's the possibility, the potentiality that will be realized in some way in objectivity. There's no modal analysis of it. The modality stuff is all in the logic of essence. It's done with. We're finished with it. So that's not here. So he doesn't give a modal analysis of Zweck. It's also not a cause of an effect. It's not a causational analysis of, or causative analysis of, Zweck either. Okay, it's not the things we sometimes associate with purpose, right? So we sometimes say it's that towards which we are aspiring in the volitional context. We sometimes say, oh, well, it's that which can be realized because it's already potentially there, right? You know how to use it in that sense. So that's our purpose, is to bring out the potentials that are already there. We say that about, human beings when we're tutoring them. We say, oh, they've got so much promise. They've got so, they're in your, all of you will eventually experience this as teachers. They'll be in your office one day and they'll say, oh, I just didn't perform on this test. I know this stuff so much better. You're like, well, the test says you don't. Right? The test says you made an F. So, I only have the test. But what do you do as a teacher, right? You've got to invest them with the sense. You always leave your office. Invest them with the sense of, oh, I do know this stuff better than I think I do. Whether they actually do or not is another matter. But invest them with that sense. It's not a lie. They probably do know this stuff better than they produced it. Invest them with that, so you're pulling out the promise. There's the potentiality that can be realized. That's not what purpose means here. It's not a cause. We think of purpose sometimes as bringing about something. It's what drives something. When we think about final causality in Aristotelian terms, we think about the final cause directing the whole. So this is the acorn to the oak tree stupid example that we always use, where there's the seeds within the oak tree have the template or blueprint that are guiding the whole process along the way. So they're causing in that sense. They're one of my professors always used to say the account of the causes in Aristotle are better account of the big causes, right? So it is because of the final cause that you have the tree emerge at the end. That's what's driving it all along the way. But that's not what's going on here either. So it's not causative in that sense. So now we know what it's not. Thanks. What is it? So the purpose is the concept. Let's just remind ourselves of that for a moment, because that's what he's saying. Purpose is the concept. Hasn't stopped being the concept. And the concept, as we know, is a deeper determination of what? It's a deeper determination of what we've seen in objectivity. It's a deeper determination of the law in mechanism. So the concept as purpose is another name for the law. It's a deeper conception of the law in mechanism. And it's the deeper conception of the animating disjunctive principle in chemism. It's the impulse. So remember where he said it's no longer a striven. It's no longer a striving. It's an urge, an impulse. What is that? Well, it's the impulse to differentiate. Now, that's a weird way of understanding a concept. Yes? Yeah. Absolutely agree. But it's an austere definition of how he understands the concept. So therefore, it's the austere definition of what he means by Zweck at this point. It's nothing other than an urge to differentiate. So it's the impulse or urge to differentiate that has played such a crucial role, as we have seen, in both of the earlier kinds of determination, both mechanical and chemical. So it's not something new. It's something that's followed from all those. We didn't all of a sudden fill it with new content. That would be the violation of immanence. What we see is that the concept just follows from the law in mechanism and the animating principle in chemism. It follows from both of those. It is now fully standing out on its own. It was buried. That's what it was when it was buried in objectivity. Now it stands out on its own, and it now is generative from itself. So in that sense, the purpose is distinctly self-realizing. Self-realizing. It is an end that is not predicated on some antecedent state of affairs. It's not an end that predicated on something that preceded it. It is not moved to realize itself by something else. Rather, it moves itself, and it does so because that's what it inherently is a process of self-generation, or at least, let's just say for the moment, generation. So it is this process of determination moving from universality, particularity to singularity. That's logic, that's how it operates. But at this moment, it's subjective. It's formal again, right? It's come out of objectivity, stepped outside of it, and now all it has as its determinations is this bare universality particularizing itself into singularity. It's got this formal subjective character again. So it's like subjectivity standing over against objectivity. Subjectivity not in the sense of human or God, divine subjectivity, but just the formal nature of the concept itself. So it's not yet objective. It's not yet objective. It must be shown to posit, that is, to produce the existence that right now it necessarily presupposes as standing over against it. It takes for granted, right? It's in relationship to it, but it hasn't shown that it actually produces it. It's actually shown that it's different than it. It can stand outside it, but it hasn't shown that it produces all of it. So that's external teleology in a nutshell. That's the setup of external teleology. It's about the realization of the purpose in virtue of the purpose itself and itself alone. Now, it follows from that, of course, that the mechanical and chemical determinations of objectivity must allow for them to be determined by the Zweck, by the purpose, by the end, by the concept. The mechanical and the chemical must be inherently malleable, susceptible to being determined by something external at this moment to them. So the end, the purpose, the Zweck, must realize itself then by sublating its own presupposition of immediate existence. It must take up, cancel their otherness from it, and realize itself in them. That's the task. The purpose cannot realize itself immediately, but only through the mediation of immediate existence. It can only realize itself through the mediation of immediate existence. Immediate existence, then, is the means, the middle. That is an instrument or tool for realizing the Zweck, the end, the concept. So there is the basic layout of the chapter. How can the concept realize itself? It can only realize itself by making use of, instrumentally making use of, the objectivity, that is the mechanical and chemical strata of objectivity that we talked about earlier in the account. So we ask this question: how can the purpose realize itself through, that is, sublate, mechanical and chemical objects and processes, when these objects and processes do not involve any kind of object realizing itself in another object? That's what's never happened in any of those processes. We didn't have an object realizing itself in and through another object. They were indifferent to one another, and they became subsumed under one another. They were tense to one another, so they get subsumed to one another, and then they get separated back out, but never one realizing itself in the other. There's been no extrinsic teleological relations in the mechanical sphere, the stratum, or the chemical stratum. So this is something wholly distinct and new. Teleological, extrinsic teleological relations are something that's not found anywhere in the mechanical or chemical dimensions of objectivity. We know that there is in mechanism a communication distribution process. We know that in chemism there's a neutralization disruption process, but in neither is there anything like realization. There's no realization going on. That is, there's no place where the purpose becomes objective. Just nowhere to be found. There is things resolving into rest, stability, and peace, equilibrium, and then being broken back out of it. But at no point would you say in any of those, oh, and that's a moment of where the concept, or anything else for that matter, certainly the concept, has realized itself. If anything, that's what never happens, right? The concept at the highest moment in chemism breaks up the neutralized product, because the neutralized product is not it, but it doesn't realize itself in it. It doesn't objectify itself in it. It breaks it up and destroys it. And in breaking it up and destroying it, it also engenders these other moments. But that's not realization of itself. That's the engendering of these other moments, but it's not the realization of itself at all. That's really what's, the non-realization of the concept is what's produced this relationship between the concept and immediate existence, objectivity as immediate existence. It's because immediate existence doesn't objectify, doesn't realize, doesn't embody the concept, that the concept stands outside of, other than objectivity as immediate existence. So at 660, look at me on page 660. The paragraph right in the middle, 660. The means is therefore the formal middle term. So here he gives a logical analysis of teleology. Right? He's going to lay it out in terms of what he calls the subjective purpose, the means, and the objective purpose, right? So we're going to go from singularity to particularity, which is the means, to universality, which is the objective concept. Look at how he puts it here. The means is therefore the formal middle term of a formal syllogism. It is something external to the extreme of the subjective purpose, subjective and subjective concept, the formal concept. So the concept purely as a syllogism. As also, therefore, to the extreme of the objective purpose, that's the realized purpose, right? So you've got the subjective purpose is one extreme. That's the moment of singularity, subjective purpose. And then the other end is that you're trying to get to is universality. That's the objective purpose. It's the connecting point between the two. That's what the middle is, right? The means is. So he says, just as particularity in the formal syllogism is an indifferent medius terminus that can be replaced by others. Moreover, just as this particularity is a middle term by virtue of being a determinist with reference to one extreme, but universality with respect to the other extreme, and therefore obtains its mediating determination by being related to another, so too the means is a mediating middle term only because it is first an immediate object, and second because it is a means by virtue of a reference connecting it with the extreme of purpose external to it, a reference that is for it a form to which it is indifferent. Now, that means that, okay, we've got a connection. We're trying to get from the subjective concept, right, the subjective purpose, which is not held in someone's mind, so it's not an intentional, volitional conception. What he means by subjective purpose here is the purpose insofar as it's formal, insofar as it's merely a syllogism, that structure. And we're going to have to see it realized out in the world, in objectivity, which is the objective purpose, the realized purpose. And that's we move from singularity of the subjective purpose to the object purpose, that the objective purpose, which is universality. How do we get there? How do we get from one extreme to the other? Through particularity. So SPU, right, is how we're moving. That's the formal structure here we're working. So there's a syllogism, the formal syllogism. You go through the means of the middle. The middle is particularity. But notice where he ends at. He says, but that means that all three of the moments are ultimately indifferent to one another. It's the structure set up this way, but they're indifferent to one another. And then he proceeds in 660, on the bottom of 660, I'm not going to go through the details of it, but at the bottom of 660 over the top of 661, he gives you an analysis of how, look, mechanism is indifferent, right? It's a particularity that bears indifference to this movement, right? That you want to bring about, you want to realize something in mechanism. Mechanism could care less about that. It's defined by its indifference. So it could, I'm caricaturing, obviously. It could care less about what you're trying to do with it, because none of that matters to it at all. It's completely indifferent to the, let's call it, intrusion of the concept in the form of the purpose into it. And then he says, well, this is true. This is on page 661, right in the middle of that, that the mechanism and chemism are both indifferent to this. They're not spheres of realization for the concept. Except insofar as, he says it's in the middle of 661, insofar as they're receptive to it. They're receptive to the concept. Now, that's obviously going to be the turning point in the argument, as I've already suggested. But let's work our way to that, because he plants that seed there, and he comes back and takes off from it in just a moment. So in the means, look at the middle, in the means, the concept and objectivity are externally linked. The means is thus a merely mechanical object. It's an instrument, mechanical object to be used. The purpose stands as singularity extrinsic to the means as particularity. The means thus inheres in the singular. That is, in the purpose, while the means qua objective particularity is subsumed under the Zweck qua universality. So it would be subsumed under the indeterminate universality. Here's the way he puts it on, this is on 660, the second full paragraph, second, third sentences, I've already read these. The relation of the object to purpose is the premise, or the immediate relation, as we have seen, is with respect to purpose an imminent reflection. I'm sorry, this is next paragraph down where I was, mechanism. Through this purposive determination present in it, the means is now also subsumptive with respect to the other extreme, the at the moment still indeterminate objectivity. So the purpose here is still in the means an external determination of objectivity, a negative unity outside of, over against the means. So you can impose it on the mechanistic stratum, but you haven't realized it. You've imposed it. So at that point, the purpose, the means, and the objectivity come apart. Each exists outside the other, or as Hegel puts it here, This is on 661. It's the paragraph that comes over from 660. Top of 661. This is page 164 in the German. He writes, in the subjective purpose, the negative self-relation is still identical with determinants as such, with the content and externality. However, in the initial objectification of purpose, effect, which is a becoming other of the simple concept, those moments come apart. So when it first tries to realize itself in objectivity at the mechanical level, because the mechanistic stratum is indifferent, it all comes apart, right? It all separates from one another. It doesn't flow, right, from one to the next. Each outside the other, or conversely, the becoming other or the externality itself consists in this coming apart. So the middle term of the syllogism here is, Hegel notes, the determinants of the object through the purpose. And this is what makes immediate existence to a means or instrument for the purpose's realization. It's the particularity of the singular that makes it universal. It's what it can do for it. That's its particularity, that's its feature. It can be realized in it, but yet it hasn't been yet. It can be realized in it. That's what would make it part of it. Well, how does that actually work? We'll take a look at 661 here, again in the middle. This is, you have, this means is object. Horrible grammar, right? Don't know how that passed through. What that should say, and what it says in German is, the means, not this means, the means is object. Right? That'll work. Not terribly pretty English grammar still there, but it's what the German says. The means is object, the totality of the concept in itself. He's still talking about the means. It has no power, no Kraft, the term is using here for power, of resistance with respect to or against purpose. It can't resist purpose. Why not? Like it initially had with respect to or against another immediate object. So it was, that's what it does. It resists, right? It exercises Gewalt of its own, resistance. Mechanical objects have this moment of resistance against other mechanical objects. But it doesn't have that now against the purpose. Why? Because it, the object now, is utterly penetratable and receptive to this communication of the purpose. Because it, the object, is itself identical with it, identical with the purpose. So all Hegel's claiming, right, at this point is for us to talk about realization, for us to talk about the objectification of the purpose, it's got to happen in the means, and the means has got to be immediate existence. But for that to be the case, it can't be that the mechanistic or chemistic dimensions of objectivity are so indifferent to it that it can't allow it to realize itself in it. It's got to permit that, or there's no hope, right, of objectification, no hope of realization. If they foreclose objectivity, if they foreclose the concept, they foreclose the purpose from ever realizing itself in it. If the mechanical and chemical are not amenable, if they're not receptive, if they're not penetratable by the concept, then this whole thing's shut down. There's no hope for realization. But they can't do that. Why? Because the concept has formed them as what they are. So we can already see where things are going to go, right? It has to be receptive. It can't not be receptive. It's defined by law and mechanism. It's defined by the disruptive principle, right, in chemism. So it's already got the concept at work in it. Now the concept standing over against it, that's a different status. Granted, right? Yes, sure. We're now talking about instrumentality rather than immanence within the mechanical stratum or the objective stratum, the chemical stratum. But here now we've got it to where it's at least set up to be receptive to them, because it's already been formed in that way. So it's, we could say, predisposed to take on the concept, to realize the concept. Now, you might say at that point, well, we're done then, right? I mean, problem solved. Objectivity is amenable to the concept's realization, so the concept realizes itself, so, we're done. It's all good. But Hegel says not so fast, as all Hegel will say, because there's permutations of this problematic that he thinks demands, imminently is demanded to be worked through. So that penetrability, that malleability, let's stay with that for a second, that immediate existence possesses by the concept is posited by the concept itself, because in mechanism, as we know, the concept was the object striving towards its center, and in chemism, The concept is the negative unity, the disrupting principle that rendered objects qua-chemical, non-self-subsistent. That means to say it's what rendered all of them penetratable. There is a center that has no center. They're open. There is a chemical process that's never done. It's always disrupting, open to next intervention. Open again, penetrable. So the particularity of the means doesn't simply inhere in the singularity of the concept, the purpose, nor does the purpose simply subsume the objectivity of the means. We go back to this way of thinking about it. It's not just out there in that, but it also doesn't subsume it either. Rather, the concept, as the purpose, determines itself or particularizes itself as immediately objective. The determinants of the object is what it is ultimately through the purpose. Being purposive, in other words, is what enables objects to strive and be non-self-subsistent, to be neutral. In other words, it's what enables them to be mechanical and chemical. And it's precisely this non-self-subsistence of objects, their penetrability, first in the striving of mechanism, then in the neutrality of chemism, that renders them in turn machtlos, he says here, powerless, before the activity of the Zweck, the purpose. Immediate existence thus serves the Zweck, the purpose, as the mediating instrument of its realization. He says, this is 661, the end of the paragraph, middle paragraph. He says, purpose is the very left. So the paragraph begins, this whole middle term is thus the totality of the syllogism. 661, this is 164 in the German. He says at the end of that paragraph, consequently, with respect to purpose, the object has the character of being powerless, machtlos. Right? It's receptive, it's malleable, it's powerless, and of serving it. There's the it's at its behest. Purpose is the subjectivity or soul of the object. Here's subjectivity and soul mean formal, right? It's the formal determination of the object. That has in the latter, the object, its concepts, purpose, external side. Here's where it can realize itself. He then says on the bottom of 661, this is 6 lines up from the bottom, it begins, the objectivity which in the means is bound with the purpose. 6 lines up from the bottom of 661, still on 164 in the German. He writes this, the objectivity that in the means is bound up with the purpose is still external to it, still external to the purpose. Because it, now talking about the objectivity, is only immediately so connected, and therefore the presupposition still persists. So what he said up to that point is, look, there's not going to be a realization unless objectivity is amenable to that. And it is amenable to that, as we've already seen in our accounts of mechanism and chemism, because law and mechanism, neutrality and the disruption of neutrality and chemism mean that it's open to, it's receptive to the work of the concept, the work of the purpose. But at this point, they're still extrinsic to one another. That's Hegel's caveat. He's wanting to say, we don't yet have realization. We still have one thing, the subjective purpose, and another thing called the means, where the means is objectivity. And those two things are still extrinsic to one another, so we don't yet have the objective purpose realized yet. He says this, the activity of the purpose, the last 3 lines on 661, the activity of the purpose through the means is for that reason, because it's still extrinsic, still directed against this presupposition. It's still trying to overcome the fact that the objectivity is extrinsic to it. It's still directed against this presupposition, and the purpose is activity, no longer mere impulse and striving. So here referencing the earlier ways of thinking about it, right? Impulse, urge, and striving. Because in the means, the moment of objectivity is posited in its determinants as something external, something outside of it, outside of the concept, outside of the purpose itself. And the simple unity of the concept now has this objectivity as such within it. It hasn't yet realized itself in it, but it has it within, it bears it within itself. Now, that's why the next section is called the realized purpose, because up to this point, we've been talking about what it would take to be realized, but we actually haven't seen the realized purpose, the objective purpose. We haven't had that actually occur. Now, what he does on 663 and 664, 663 over to 666, all of that account there, which is fairly dense in a lot of places, is show and lay out this instrumentality. Right? So he doesn't start by saying, so now we have realization. What he says is we have instrumental relation between, all right, still this, he's working through this extrinsic relationship between the concept as end, as purpose, and objectivity as immediate existence. Objectivity as immediate existence, ripe and ready for realization of the concept, right? That's what we've just seen happen. It's amenable, it's susceptible to this. It's receptive to it. Why? Because it's already been formed by the concept buried within it. But we don't go immediately to realization. Why? Because it's still an extrinsic relation. So Hegel stays with that extrinsic relation for a moment and says, look, that extrinsic relation means two things. That, as he puts it here, the subjective purpose can be reduced to immediate existence. It can just fall back into immediate existence and be reduced to itself there. Not realize itself there, but just be imposed on it and be completely identified. He calls that a violence. Gewalt is what he's calling this is what he calls it on 663. This is right at 166, transition from 165 to 166 in German. That the purpose immediately refers to an object and makes it into a means. So here's the subjective purpose now dealing with objectivity as its means, its instrument as a means, as also that through this means it determines another object, may be regarded as Gewalt, as violence. It's imposing itself on it. Inasmuch as purpose appears of an entirely different nature, there's the extrinsicality. They're separate from one another. The concept's not in objectivity, it's imposing itself on objectivity. And the two objects, the subjective purpose and objectivity, are in like manner mutually independent totalities, one being imposed on the other. But that the purpose posits itself in immediate connection with the object. It imposes itself on objectivity. That's its mediation. And between itself and this object inserts another object, may be regarded as the cunning of reason. So there's that line, right? Everybody loves to quote this out of the philosophy of history, right? Which I always like to remind people, Hegel didn't write that book because it's not a book, right? But okay. We know that line out of the introduction to the philosophy of history, where he says, here's what spirit is. It's the, works behind the back of the actors within history as the cunning of reason. Hegel's here, he's giving you a definition of the cunning of reason. The cunning of reason is the imposition of the concept, qua purpose, on not recalcitrant, but a receptive objectivity. That's all it is. And it's a violence. Because the two are extrinsically related totalities. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not realization. That's imposition. That's not realization. That's the imposition of subjective purpose on the means. And Hegel's claim about that is this. Right? He says this at over on 665 is where he eventually says this. This is 7 lines up from the bottom. So look at 665 with me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7. Yep. If you want to have the purpose being imposed on objectivity, and even when objectivity is receptive to it, it always means you're going to have to put something else into that relationship. It requires always, once you've imposed it, it requires something else to impose that, and to impose that, to keep that imposed. So this goes on to infinity. Spurious infinity. He says, since the two are thus posited as diverse, so subjective purpose and means, objectivity, and means for their connection must be interjected between this objectivity and the subjective purpose. But such a means is equally an object already determined by purpose, and between this objectivity and the teleological determination, a new means is to be interjected, and so on to infinity. So there you get a spurious infinity. The infinite progress of mediation is thereby set in motion. Now he says, you can go down the other route. You can reduce immediate existence to just whatever the subjective purpose is. So the first one is, okay, the subjective purpose will just be whatever immediate existence is. And therein you get this reduction of the subjective purpose to immediate existence. Singularity becomes particularity, but then it becomes another particular and another particular and another particular. So it's spurious infinity that way. Or you can say, no, that's the wrong way to think about it. We need to reduce immediate existence to subjective purpose It is just whatever the subjective purpose is. But here again, you get subjective purpose has to be reintroduced. Another subjective purpose has to be reintroduced. So you get a spurious infinity that way. As he says here, the same happens as regard the other premise, the connection of the means with the yet indeterminate object. Since the two terms are utterly self-subsistent, there's that problem of extrinsicality, right? They're both totality centered to self. The purpose and objectivity, they're separate to themselves. They can be united only in a third. Something's got to mediate the relationship between the two of them. And so on to infinity, because you're going to need it and need it and need it again and need it again. So what happens as a result of that? Look, all that Hegel's done, he's done a lot, but all he's really done at this point is said, look, if we're going to think about realization as demanding of particularity, demanding of objectivity, that it be amenable, malleable, receptive to the concept qua purpose, then, and you still have them as extrinsic to one another, then you set yourself up for the spurious infinity problem. You're either going to reduce the purpose to existence, and then you're going to need another one, another bit of existence, another bit of existence. You're going to get spurious infinity that way, or you can go reverse. You can say, well, immediate existence just is whatever the concept purpose is, and then you're going to need another one for that, another one for that, another one for that subjective. You get a reductive, you get a spurious infinity either way. Well, look at what he says in the bottom of 666. 666. The next page over. Last 4 lines on 666, going over to 667. He says this. The result now is that external purposiveness, that's what we've been analyzing up to this point. We've been trying to figure out ways in which the purposiveness that is purpose can be realized in objectivity. But as we now begun to realize about it, the problem is it's extrinsic. That's Hegel's claim, right? That's his analysis, is that what undermines realization of purpose in objectivity is that the two are distinct from one another, they're extrinsic to one another. And so far, the only way we've been able to get them to work is either one is reduced to the other, and in doing that, we get a spurious infinity in both directions. Either objectivity is reduced to the purpose, or purpose is reduced to objectivity. Either way, you get a reduction, you get a spurious infinity generated out of both sides. But then he says this, the result now is that external purposiveness, which only has so far the form, that's always a red flag for Hegel, right? It's just the form of teleology, not actually the content yet. Only goes so far as to be a means, not an objective purpose. Notice that's what we were trying to get to. We were trying to get from S to P to U. We were trying to get from S, singularity, the subjective purpose, through the particularity to the U of objective purpose, the realized purpose. But we never got there. All we ever got to was either particularity reduced to singularity or singularity reduced to particularity, one way or the other. We didn't get them. We didn't get the realization. Particularity is not doing the work. It's not able to do it, even though it's amenable to it. It's not doing the work. He says, only goes so far as to be a means, not to be an objective purpose, because subjective purpose remains an external subjective determination. So I read that as so far failure. So far, the realization ain't happened, right? Because the realization would be we will have gotten from subjective purpose through the means to objective purpose, its realization. He rephrases this, last line on 666 over to 667. Or, insofar as purpose is active and attains completion, albeit only in a means, there's the caveat again, only in a means, not yet in full universality, it is still bound up with objectivity immediately. It is sunk into it. Here's that language again. I thought we were emerged out of it. We have, but now we're trying to realize ourselves in it. Right? Purpose is trying to realize itself in it. So what's happening? It's sinking into it. That's the submersion of either singularity into particularity or particularity into singularity. Either one. It's thinking of both. Purpose is itself an object, and as one may say, it does not attain a means because its realization is needed before such a realization can be brought about through a means. Okay. What the hell did that just say? So slow it down and read it again. Look at what he's saying. Purpose, he's talking about the concept, is still an object. It's still an object set over against another object called objectivity. And as one may say, it does not attain a means, it does not realize itself, because its realization is needed before. It's a prerequisite. You need it to be realized before it can be realized. I'm sorry, how? Because its realization is needed before such a realization can be brought about through a means. So the realization has to happen before the realization can happen? Yes. What does that mean? It's got to mean something more about the receptivity, the amenability of the means of objectivity. It's got to mean something about the nature of objectivity, that it's more than just ready for objectivity to be realized in it. It's got to already be realizing it. Look at what he says in the next paragraph down. But the result is, in fact, not only an external purposive connection, but the truth of such a connection. You know, that language always means there's something more here than what's already been done. The truth of such a connection. What's that? Inner purposive connection and an objective purpose. Well, yeah, that's where we want to get to. But notice what the price is. It can't be external. The model that external or extrinsic purposiveness is set up on is itself the very reason why we never get to objective purpose. It's why we only ever get, at this stage, violent imposition or violent reduction of purpose to immediate existence or immediate existence to purpose. We never get the objective realization of it. We always get S as P or P as S. We never get SPU. But the result is, in fact, not only an external purposive connection, emphasize external, it can't be just external, but the truth of such a connection, inner purposive connection, and an objective purpose. Now, at that moment, you want to say, okay, I think what Hegel's just said is the only way you can have extrinsic purposiveness, the only way you can have the realization of purpose in the means of objectivity, in and through the means of objectivity, so that you get ultimately to objective purpose realized. The only way you can have that is if it's realized already in objectivity. Yep. And what does that mean? It means that the purpose can't be extrinsic, which is how we're thinking of it in extrinsic, how it's set up, and extrinsic purposiveness. It's got to already be intrinsic. The truth of extrinsic purposiveness is intrinsic purposiveness. Hegel has just stated the conclusion that he's arguing for. Now, like always in Hegel, you want to say, okay, you got an argument for that? I mean, you can't just assert that. You can't say, so, it's got to be intrinsic. It can't be just extrinsic. That's a problem, as we've seen, because all you'll ever end up with then there is never objective purpose. You'll always end up with some version of subjective purpose. Either particularity is reduced to it, the means is reduced to it, or it's reduced to the means, and so you'll be blown out either way. So what do you need? You need to have intrinsic purposiveness. But how in the world does intrinsic purposiveness prove of itself to be the truth of extrinsic purposiveness? No. Glad you asked. Here's what Hegel has to say about that. Let me just set this up, and we'll come back and talk about this in detail next week. But look at what he does here. So the next line down. So Hegel does this a lot. This is part of learning how to read Hegel. We've been here many, many times. Hegel starts off a paragraph by saying, here's what needs to be shown. First sentence is usually some version of the conclusion, right, that he wants to eventually show or needs to be shown. The problem here, right, he's diagnosed that the problem here is extrinsicality, in a word, right, that the purpose stands over against objectivity. So what do we got to show? We got to show that objectivity is not just amenable to this, it's not just susceptible to this, but is already itself doing this. It's already realizing this. So it's already intrinsic. The concept is intrinsic. It's not extrinsic. It's already intrinsic. Is at work in objectivity itself. So then he starts to lay out an argument. The rest of the paragraph, the rest of the whole section, frankly, is an argument. So look at what he says here. Let me just set it up, and then we'll come back and talk about how this works from there. So next sentence, the self-subsistent existence, really it should be, of the object. So you don't have existence in there, but that's what he's talking about. Of the object over against the concept that purpose presupposes is posited in this presupposition as an unessential reflective shine and is already sublated in and for itself. So it stands over against it. That's how it posits, reflective shine, over and distinct from it. It's an external relation. but it's already sublated in and for itself. Well, how so? How is it already sublated? How is that extrinsicality already taken up and overcome? He says, the activity of the purpose truly is, therefore, only the exposure of this reflective shine and the sublation of it. Well, that's what we've been doing, exposing what the reflective shine, the extrinsicality, does, and how that undermines the realization. Then this has one of these great moments, right, in Hegel. Here's what he says. As the concept has demonstrated. Like, didn't you get this? No. Sorry, I didn't get it. As the concept is demonstrated, the first object becomes, by virtue of communication and a means, the first object is objectivity, becomes by means of communication a means, by means of communication is referencing back to the mechanical process of communication, also the chemical process. A means, for it implicitly is the totality of the concept. Not explicitly, right? Not yet posited as such, but that's what it is. The concept's doing that work. It's what's bringing all those various mechanical objects together, initially striving, catching them up in the process of bringing them all together, communication. But in chemism, actually, they're striving towards the center, right? They're striving to be one another themselves. So it's already that's already the concept at work in them. It's already realized itself in them. That's what the argument's going to be. For it implicitly is the totality of the concept and its determinateness, for which is none other than the externality itself. It just is what that is, and is posited as something only external and unessential. Is posited in purpose itself. So it's what purpose is actually doing, already there. It just wasn't called purpose yet. Therefore, as the latter's own moment, as purpose's own moment, concept's own moment, not as anything that stands on its own over against it. Notice there's the kicker. Right? How did we start off this discussion? The concept stepped outside of objectivity. Objectivity is now rendered immediate existence for the sake of the concept. They stand outside one another. They're extrinsic to one another. Now the question is, well, how does the concept as purpose get realized in objectivity? And here is the problem. It can't as long as they're extrinsic to one another. Right? As long as the stepping out of the concept from objectivity was some kind of, hey, you stand over there, I'll stand over here, and I don't really have anything to do with you anymore. Now, how do I get back to you? Right? How do I realize myself in you? Well, I'm open to it, says objectivity. If you want to try, go at it. But the going at it is going to be brutally violent, rough, right? Because you're going to either impose yourself on me, sorry for the caricature, or I'm just going to be suffocating of you. In other words, we're going to have a little battle here. What's that all predicated on? The extrinsicality of both moments. You'll never get universality out of that struggle between, this isn't a master-slave struggle from the phenomenology, here it is between singularity and particularity. Particularity collapses into singularity, singularity collapses into particularity. One of the other goes into the other because they're thought of as what? Discrete, external, extrinsic moments. But Hegel's saying, as he just said here, we know already in our account of mechanism and chemism, as the concept has demonstrated, right? We know already that that's not the case. It's not just that objectivity is receptive. Yeah, I'm good, let's try this. The concept's already been at work in mechanism, chemism. So as he says, is posited in purpose itself. Therefore, as the latter, that is purpose's own moment, not as anything that stands on its own over against it. So it's not over against it. Well, it certainly seemed to be at the end of chemism. It stepped out, right? Got on its own. Yeah, and that set up extrinsic purposiveness. But what allows for extrinsic purposiveness to actually take place is the thing that it has stepped out from, the purpose has stepped out from, the concept has stepped out from. That thing called objectivity, now as immediate existence, is actually already suffused with the workings of the concept itself. It's what makes it what it is. And therefore, it's not something that stands on its own over against the concept. It can't. As a result, the determination of the object as a means is altogether immediate. There is no need, therefore, for the subjective purpose to exercise any violence. It doesn't have to impose itself on it because the other side is receptive to it. It doesn't need to, the subjective purpose doesn't need to exercise any violence to make the object into a means. No need of extra reinforcement. The resolution, the resolve, this determination of itself is the only positive externality of the object, which is therein immediately subjected to purpose and has no other determination as against it than that of the nothingness of the being in and for itself. It is what it is by virtue of the movement of the concept. So it doesn't have to impose itself on it. The concept doesn't have to impose itself on a subjective content or subjective objectivity. That objectivity is already the movement of the concept itself. They were never really extrinsic. They are extrinsic. They're separable from one another, right? This is constant with Hegel. They're separable from one another. They're distinct. That's what happened at the end of chemism. The concept stepped out from objectivity. And then we track down, what does that mean that it's separable, that it's extrinsic from objectivity? It means that you've got extrinsic purposiveness. And the problems that arise from that, namely subjective infinity either way, right? I'm sorry, not subjective and spurious infinity either way. Either you're going to reduce the world to subjective purposiveness or subjective purposiveness to the world. But when you realize that the world just is that movement, that process, then they're not really extrinsic to one another. The premise that was underlying there, the presumption that was underlying there, it's false. It's wrong. It's been undermined by the account we've already made. So that's what he means by it's the only positive externality of the object, which is therein immediately subjected to purpose, because it is just purpose, so it's subjected to it immediately. And has no other determination. The objectivity has no other determination as against purpose, than that of the nothingness of the being in and for itself. There's nothing into it except for this movement of the concept. So he says now in the next paragraph down, the second sublating of objectivity through objectivity differs from the first. Now he's going to compare, right, how we understood it first, now how we understand it now. And this won't be an imposition. It does not require violence. It'll be a true realization, because why? The realization was already happening. That's how you read that line back up on the top of 667. Purpose is itself an object, and as one may say, it does not attain a means because its realization is needed before such a realization can be brought about through a means. You need its realization already to be happening before its realization, happens. And it is, because that's what we've shown in both mechanism and chemism, is the movement of the concept was already there. Its realization is happening. They were never extrinsic to it. Not truly. But that means that the concept, if it's not extrinsic to objectivity, and objectivity is not there for its imposition, violent imposition against it, but if it's actually actualized, realized in it, then the concept has to be immanent within objectivity. And that means we're talking about an intrinsic purposiveness, not an extrinsic purposiveness. There we have the concept generating itself in and through objectivity. And Hegel will say that's no longer a purpose, that's life. That's life. Now the Kantians get all excited and say, aha, that's an organism. And they go looking in the first bit of the idea chapter to say, well, look, he must be talking about organisms now because, he just talked about what we all recognize in Kant as an organism. We'll see if that's the case. We will be talking about really odd things, right? We will be talking about really odd things for a logic. Hegel admits this, right? He says, we're going to talk about things like, respiration, irritation. What do those got to do with logic? What does life as a logical category even mean? And the culmination of the life process is sex. What's that got to do with the logic? I mean, come on. I wanted some things not to be touched by the logic. Least we could do is not get that involved. Well, it's here as well because, it's got to replicate itself somehow. It's got to reproduce itself somehow. So life has to reproduce. How does it reproduce? Well, I'll talk about that. Hegel acknowledges this doesn't look like it belongs in the logic. Life doesn't look like it belongs in the logic, let alone the sexual nature of life, the sexual reproduction of life doesn't belong in the logic. So what's the relation? He asks this very clearly in the idea chapter where he says very clearly, what then is the relationship between logical life, natural life, and spiritual life? Yes, please. We'd love to hear about it. Right? And he gives a very short account of what he thinks the difference is. But you're going to come away going, I think I know what spiritual life is, because that's like human beings. I think I know what natural life is, because that's like natural organisms. But logical life, it seems like it's a set of structures by which the process of the concept generates itself. Yeah, well, why call that life? Because it's a process that generates itself. It's a self-engendering process. It's the Lebensprozess. It's the life process. And what is it defined by? At its very core, nothing other than, as Hegel's about to tell you, an immanent urge to differentiate itself. All right. That's enough for this week, I think. Questions, issues, problems? We'll get to all that crazy stuff. All the crazy stuff that we haven't been doing. We'll get to the crazy stuff, that particular crazy stuff next week. Yep. Yeah.
This is sort of maybe a stupid question, but is there a relationship that could be drawn easily between, especially at the beginning of the teleology chapter, and Gestalt in Heidegger, instrumentality here? And
I mean, insofar as that you're talking about the instrumentalization of the world in both cases, that everything is at the disposal. Broadly speaking, yes, but is that really different than what Husserl says about the mechanization and the mathematization of the world? Frankly, not at that level. Heidegger wants to say, right, Heidegger scholars, please correct me if I'm wrong, but Heidegger wants to say this is how being shows up for Dasein. This is how presence takes place. We're presented with the world as disposed to, a repository for our usage and functioning with it. So to not take advantage of it is almost like, are you not hearing the call of the being itself? It's asking, please use me. Right? That, of course, is obliterating the way in which it's given. Right? So, as Heidegger famously says in the Technology essay, quoting Hölderlin, but not with Hölderlin's meaning, where the danger grows, there grows the saving power. So the danger is the occlusion of the process of revealing itself, right? That every elethe has lethe at its very core. Every revealing is a concealing at its core. So we will have forgotten the concealing at its core, right? And just used it up. That's the danger of it. I don't see that kind of claim. So that's all, in reference to how the world's presented to us. And Hegel's talking about the relationship, that's what I've tried to emphasize with the notion of Zweck. Zweck's not us. Zweck's not a purpose that we have. This is the concept itself. So you can say that it's the instrumentalization of the world. I think that's true, and you can compare them in that way. But Hegel's point is that, and the problem with that is not that that the lethe, the withholding that's necessary for every revealing has been foreclosed. That's Heidegger's analysis, right? That's the danger, but if you'll recall that danger, then there's the hope of the saving power growing there. You can have Gelassenheit, you can have releasement in and with technology. He says you can hold tools but not be ruled by them. This is in the Gelassenheit essay, if I recall, many years ago. But what Hegel wants to say is that, no, wait, the problem is extrinsicality in the first place. That you think objectivity is something other than the concept itself. When I've just been arguing in mechanism and chemism that it can't be, in fact, it's not that. So a Hegelian perspective about that would say the premise under which that's operating, that the being is disclosed to us and calls us and is presented to us, given to us literally in a certain way, is the problem itself, right? That's to miss that the concept's already at work in the given itself, to put it in broadly Hegelian terms. Is that helpful and useful?
Yeah, I was trying to sort of tease out, or see if you would tease out the Hegel not sticking with it, I suppose, but Heidegger thinks there's a historical attunement, but it's not necessarily the only way in which beings could present themselves to us. But it seems like we are kind of stuck in it in a different way between the two. And
yeah, I mean, there's an argument among Heidegger scholars whether being has to turn or we turn. I'm putting it very crass, right? Die Kehre is either our doing, right, or it's being's doing. And if you look in the Beiträge, the contributions text that he wrote in 36 or whatever, 37, I forget what the dates are for that, he's very clearly saying we await the turning of being. We await a new sending of being. This is Heidegger. We await a new sending of being. So it's been dispensed to us at this point as a kind of pure instrumentality, right? Pure Gestalt, right? That's all we have. But we need to see what a new turning of being would be, and we await that. So this is the waiting, the tending, the shepherding. These are all these kind of, what are classically called passive metaphors in Heidegger. But Heidegger also has these moments where he says, so here's where the debate comes from, that we have to start treating things differently in order for things to present themselves differently. So this is where he has them on, like in the Gelassenheit lecture, where he says we have to, the attunement is not just bestowed upon us, but we have to actually have this is what Reiner Scherman famously called the practical a priori. We have to act in a different way. We have to be released in order for things to be released for us. He gets this from Eckhart, but he ports it back into Heidegger. There's room for it in Heidegger, where Heidegger's talking about it in the Gelassenheit essay, where he says, I have to be able to hold technology in my hand and not be demanded by it to simply and only use it. I'll use it, but I'll use it, as he says at one point, freely. Of course, what the hell does that exactly mean? Well, it's got to mean something like not through self-determination, because it's all, in Heidegger, we're worried about willfulness in the first place. That's part of the problem, right? It's what, the will to technology is part of the problem in this account. So it seems to me that at that point, what Heidegger wants to say is, well, we can do something ourselves to turn, right? This dispensation can be different. We can be released in order for being to present itself differently for us. None of that in Hegel. This is a conceptual problem in Hegel. It's not a practical a priori. It's not we're waiting on new topology of being to present itself, new history of being, new dispensation, and new sending of being itself. That's not because obviously we're not dealing in time, right? There's no history here. We're not dealing with that. This is a conceptual problem. Right? The conceptual problem is that there is a distinction to be made between the concept and objectivity, but that distinction in and of itself is not sufficient to understand how the concept can be realized in objectivity. The only thing that's sufficient for that is to see that the extrinsicality is undermined by the account we've already been given of the concept at work in objectivity, in mechanism and chemism. So as disappointing as this is, right? Hegel's answer is, as the concept is demonstrated in mechanism and chemism, objectivity was never extrinsic to the concept itself. The concept was always at work, forming and engendering mechanism and chemism themselves. So of course, it's almost like secondary. Well, of course, the concept could be realized in it, right? Because it's been prepared by itself already. That's almost like a side effect now, right? Is the way he tends to think about it. That's because intrinsic purposiveness is what makes possible, it's the truth of make possible extrinsic purposiveness. So you'll never get to objective purpose unless you understand that the singularity and particularity were never separable from one another, ultimately. So it's a different problem in that. Does that make some sense? Sorry to go on so long. But it is a point of comparison you can make. The other thing I would say is what I suggested just a moment ago. The model that we oftentimes use to talk about Hegel is a model that's extrapolated from, do I have time to rant for a second? Yeah. We extrapolated from the philosophy of history, introduction to the philosophy of history, where we say, okay, what is spirit? What's the concept? What's the purpose? And he there gives you this account. Remember, this isn't a lecture. This is students writing down these notes, not Hegel writing this text. But he gives you this analysis where it sounds like, oh, spirit works at the back behind historical agents to do its bidding, right? They're working out its plan. It's the cunning of reason that they're not aware of themselves. Well, right. That's because it's being presented as the concept is other than objectivity. We know he's just told us that that's not the truth of the matter. But we tend to stay with that model of spirit or concept or whatever we're talking about in Hegel as being a kind of invading, imposing force against the recalcitrant, world out there and sucking up everything into its totalizing, subsumptive, reductive, whatever. I would just submit that Hegel's a little more nuanced than that, and probably a lot more nuanced than that. In fact, he's rejecting me. That's why I always find it interesting. He's the one who brought up the cunning of reason. Nobody asked him, there's nobody stopping and go, but in your lecture course, you're going to talk about the cunning. He doesn't do that. He says, an example of that would be the cunning of reason, term that we get fixated on. And he's using an example of violence being imposed by the concept to impose itself on objectivity. But then he goes on to argue that you don't need any violence because it's already at work. It's not violently imposed. It's a realization that's made possible precisely because the objective world is alive with the concept. It's the concept's life being played out. Other comments, questions? I promise not to rant so much. All right. I will see you next week. We'll work on the transition from teleology into idea into life. And we'll talk about all the craziness that's in life, or at least most of the craziness that's in life next week. And yeah, we'll ask the perennial question everybody wants to know, which is, of course, is there a logic of sex? Right? We all want to know that. So yeah, there is. We'll talk about it next week.